Kids naturally played together and formed little groups to explore the area, as there wasn't much else to do back in the late 90s in rural Pennsylvania. The town was old, and the earliest records I could find about it dated back to the 1780s when it was first established as a small trade post, since Pennsylvania had already become a state by then. My town had a single church at its center, an old schoolhouse that had been turned into a regular home beside it, and a pasture behind, with dense forest enclosing 3 sides of the small community. My father grew up around here and was full of tales and old stories about the area. One story was about a small fort, originally French, later controlled by the British, and finally used by colonial settlers. No one was exactly sure where it had been located, but there were old references to it in historical research I had done. One of the main stories about the fort was that it sat along an important trade path used by local indigenous tribes and the increasing number of settlers arriving in the area. Predictably, as more people moved in, tensions rose, eventually leading to open conflict between the settlers and native groups. The fort was said to have burned down in a violent struggle, with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, the native tribes were driven out by a local militia. My dad always said the land held onto those tragedies, that there was something off about it. When entire families are wiped out and people are forced from their homes, bad energy lingers. When we were kids playing in the woods, we were always told 2 things. If the forest suddenly went silent, leave right away, and if you ever heard your name being called while deep in the woods, don't answer, just go home and don't look back. Act like you never heard anything at all. Everyone in town knew the area had a strange quality. Most days were normal, but sometimes it felt like something out of a storybook, either a fairy tale or a nightmare. The beings in the woods were the most well-known presence. Everyone in town respected them and kept their distance. Other things were best left entirely alone. Now, here's what happened to me. When I was 10 years old, I became obsessed with the idea of going camping. It was mid-August, hot and humid in the daytime, but pleasantly cool at night. I convinced 2 friends to go with me, and they were all for it. Normally, no one camped in our woods. Parents, mine included, weren't thrilled about the idea of 3 kids, ages 10 to 11, spending the night out there alone. My dad agreed to let us go, but only if he came with us to keep watch. I didn't love that idea, but I agreed. Before that night, I went to scout a good camping spot. I knew of a clearing near the creek that was mostly level and easy to get to. I wanted to make sure the area was clear of debris so we could set up our tents without a problem. By that point, I was familiar with the beings in the woods, so before heading in, I left a small offering, as was customary. I didn't see them, so I figured all was fine. Once I got to the clearing, I got to work, moving branches, clearing rocks, and making a fire pit. I even gathered some wood so we'd have fuel later. I was so focused on preparing the site that I didn't realize how silent everything around me had become. When I say silent, I mean absolutely nothing. Not a single bird, no insects, not even the wind stirring the leaves. I froze, listening, barely breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, in the distance, I heard a crow call out. Instantly, other sounds returned, the chirping of robins, the faint rustling of leaves. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Maybe I had just been making too much noise, I reasoned, and everything had gone quiet because of me. That evening, around 6 p.m., my friends arrived with their backpacks and tents. My dad and I had just finished dinner. We packed up everything we needed and set out. Nothing unusual happened as we hiked to the site. Even after we set up our tents, lit the fire, and made s'mores, it was shaping up to be a great night. Around 11 p.m., as we got ready to sleep, the wind picked up. My dad mentioned we might get some rain, but he didn't look as relaxed as he usually did. He loved rain, but something seemed to be bothering him. Soon, we all started feeling uneasy. We had set up our tents in a half circle around the fire pit, facing the creek with the forest behind us. My dad's military-style tent was to my left, mine was in the middle, and my 2 friends shared one on the right. The wind howled for a while, then suddenly stopped. Silence. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Even the creek sounded muffled. I could hear my own heartbeat. My friends must have felt the same because I heard them shifting around nervously. One of them unzipped his tent. Naturally, I did the same. The moment I poked my head out, I saw my dad already standing outside, gripping a machete, staring into the tree-line. My friend whispered, asking if I had heard that sound. I hadn't. My heart was pounding too hard to hear much of anything. We crawled halfway out of our tents to see what my dad was looking at, but we saw only darkness. Then, from deep in the woods, we heard it. A voice, distant and faint. "Hello!" It wasn't right. Something about it felt off, like whoever was speaking was trying too hard to sound human. My dad tightened his grip on his machete. The voice called out again, "Hello!" This time it sounded oddly delicate, almost unnatural. My dad motioned for me to throw more wood on the fire. I really didn't want to leave my tent, but I did. As the fire grew brighter, my dad stepped back near it, keeping his eyes on the woods. My other friend had poked his head out of his tent by now, and all four of us were watching the tree-line, waiting. Nothing came out. The voice never called again. An hour passed. My dad sat on a rock, machete in hand, watching the woods while the fire crackled. My friends eventually crawled back into their tents. I stayed out tending the fire, then, rustling, from the right, just beyond the firelight, my friend closest to the woods poked his head out and whispered, "What?" like he thought I had said something, but I hadn't. I put a finger to my lips, signaling him to be quiet. My dad was standing beside me now, telling us both to hush. Then we all heard it. "Come here." Same eerie, unnatural voice. We didn't move. We didn't answer. We just stared into the darkness. After a few moments, whatever it was moved back into the woods. The sound was light, almost dainty, like something stepping carefully away. That was the last we heard of it. Sometime in the early morning, just before dawn, the normal sounds returned. Crickets, birds, the wind through the leaves. Once daylight came, we packed up and hiked back. We barely spoke the whole way. Every few minutes, we stopped to listen, to look. But we saw nothing. When we finally reached my backyard, my dad broke the silence. That never happened. Happened, and we were better off keeping quiet about it. His face was filled with fear, as if even he had never encountered something like that before. To this day, I still have no idea what or who it was. Later in life, I asked my aunt, who lived next door and had also grown up in the area, if she had ever experienced anything similar. Even she was tight-lipped, simply saying that we never should have gone camping there and that my dad was foolish for allowing it. Since then, I've moved away from my hometown and now live in a different part of the country. Oddly enough, I've come across similar stories here in the Southeast, always accompanied by the same unwillingness to discuss what it might have been. If anyone out there has any insight, I'd love to hear it. As a kid, I grew up in a suburb called Ridgeway, just outside of Perth, Western Australia. It sounds nice, doesn't it? But there were no ridges, and a significant portion of the area was public housing, known for being a tough place to live. Despite that, I had a great childhood. My friends and I made the most of what we had, spending hours playing in the nearby bushland. We rode bikes, built swings, caught frogs, and explored every inch of the place. I'd say I knew those trails like the back of my hand. There wasn't much that felt creepy about the bush, except for the fact that an old care home sat on a hill on the western edge. It was called Briarwood Nursing Home, and security guards patrolled the grounds, so we were chased away more than once for wandering too close. Behind the nursing home was an unfinished structure, almost like an underground bunker, as if someone had started construction but never completed it. We explored the place a few times. It was half dirt, half brick, and looked like people had been there before. We found old canned food, some broken bottles, ragged clothes, and other random junk. Life moved on. It was 2005 and I was 15 years old. I had tried weed a couple of times and thought it would be cool to camp in the bush with my two best friends. We pitched a cheap tent on the western side, far enough from the nursing home that we wouldn't run into security. We got a tent from a discount store, and at around 5 p.m., we hiked down into a valley to set it up before dark. I had managed to get a little weed, and we had a makeshift pipe. It was our first real experience smoking, and we were buzzing with excitement. We didn't tell anyone what we were doing, knowing full well our parents wouldn't approve. As the sun set, we got a small fire going and each took a hit. My friends were chatting away, but something felt off to me. I suddenly had this strong sensation that we were being watched. My ears picked up every tiny sound, and I swore I heard faint rustling in the distance. My friends were still laughing and joking, blaming my paranoia on the weed. I quickly waved my arms and hushed them. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but before I could finish my sentence, a chilling voice called out from the darkness, letting us know they could see us. It sounded rough, almost like a deranged person. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned to my friends, and by the looks on their faces, I knew they'd heard it too. For a few seconds, we were frozen in fear, but instinct kicked in, and we bolted toward the nursing home, desperate to get out of the bush. As we sprinted through the valley, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A tall, shadowy figure stood atop the half-built structure, cloaked in darkness like a reaper watching us flee. I couldn't make sense of it, and I sure as hell wasn't going to stop to figure it out. We finally reached the edge of the bush and looked back in confusion and relief, only to see a pale, ghostly shape at the bottom of the hill, moving toward us. We didn't stop running until we were safe at my house. That night, none of us dared go back, instead crashing at my place, too shaken to sleep. The next morning, once the sun was up, we returned to gather our things. Despite the terrifying night, the bush was still our playground, so we didn't stop going there. A few days later, while playing near the old swing in the trees, just 50 meters from where we had camped, we suddenly heard shrill, desperate screams. A girl's voice cried out, begging for help, followed by the sound of a chainsaw revving up. I looked over the mound where the tree swing stood, but the bush was too thick to see anything. It didn't even seem possible for someone to be on that side of the land. There were no trails, just dense vegetation. Once again, we ran back to my house, but something even stranger happened when we got there. A man, an older Asian guy, was circling the front of my house on a bicycle. He had a bucket on his head. I had seen him around town before, but the way he stared at me made my skin crawl. We grabbed my dad and my dog and went back to search the bush, but we found nothing. These experiences left me questioning everything. Had we all imagined it? Were we experiencing some kind of shared delusion? Who was the person yelling in the night? Was there really someone out there with a chainsaw? Was the nursing home hiding something sinister? Or was something supernatural at play in those woods? To this day, I still don't know. Maybe I never will. But if anyone out there is familiar with Ridgway Bush and has had a similar encounter, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you for listening. I wandered through the nearby forest and eventually set up a small campfire. After spending a few hours by the flickering flames, mindlessly scrolling on my phone, an odd sensation crept over me. I couldn't pinpoint the reason, but I brushed it off as paranoia and decided it was time to call it a night. I have a habit of tying my tent zippers together, just a precaution in case anything or anyone stumbles across my campsite. Sometime after falling asleep, I was jolted awake by the sound of my zipper being tampered with. What the intruder didn't know was that I always secure them tightly. I always carry a handgun wherever I go, so I silently reached for it and lay still, straining my ears. I caught the faintest sound of footsteps circling my campsite, followed by a dim shadow flickering against the soft glow of the dying fire. Minutes passed in eerie silence. As cautiously as I could, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The moment I did, a shiver ran through me. Standing at the edge of my campsite were two figures, barely illuminated by the fire's embers. I couldn't tell which direction they were facing, so I remained frozen, watching. Then, without warning, one of them lunged at me, tackling me to the ground and stabbing me twice in the upper body. But what they didn't know was that I was once a competitive grappler. Adrenaline kicked in, and within seconds, I had flipped him over and was pounding his face relentlessly until he went limp. I staggered to my feet, contemplating whether to shoot him, but I couldn't bring myself to fire at someone who was no longer a threat. Heart pounding, I sprinted toward my car, fumbling to grab a flashlight. My thoughts were scattered. Was there another one still lurking? I shined the beam into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Overwhelmed, I hesitated before stepping halfway out of the car, utterly confused. I was sure I had just taken one of them down and that the other was at least unconscious. I climbed back in, grabbed a towel, and pressed it firmly against my bleeding shoulder, trying to numb the pain. After a moment, I forced myself to get out and cautiously walked back toward my tent, scanning every direction, terrified another attack was coming. My eyes darted between the two spots where I had fought them, a few feet apart, but there was nothing. No bodies, no blood, no footprints, no sound, nothing. Panic surged through me. My mind was racing. How could they have vanished? I knew for a fact I had shot one and knocked the other unconscious. It made no sense. In sheer terror, I fired several shots into the woods, then ran to my car, jumped in, and sped off, leaving my gear behind in the middle of the night. As I drove deeper into the forest, windows slightly cracked. An eerie sound sent my blood running cold. Laughter. Deep, echoing laughter from multiple voices. It made no sense. I had already put some distance between myself and the campsite, but somehow, the sound carried as if they were right beside me. Panicked, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the road, my pulse pounding in my ears. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered that night or how they vanished, but the scars on my body remind me that it was real. One detail still haunts me, though. No matter how hard I try to remember, I can't recall any features on their faces. Just an empty, unnatural darkness where their faces should have been. We had a camper and a large aero tent, and the site was a decent size with a few wide trails that cut through it, leading to the road. It's important to mention that there weren't any other campers for miles around us. We set up camp in a small nook, with thick bushes on one side and our camper van parked on the other, meaning anyone walking along the trails would pass right between us. We spent the day riding dirt bikes and eventually went to our separate sleeping spots. As usual, I had trouble dozing off. Around 2 a.m., according to my phone, I peered through the semi-transparent mesh of the tent wall and spotted something. A single branch or object stretched across the trail. It was faintly glowing. I stared at it for a long while, trying to make sense of it, and the light never flickered or moved. Then the next thing happened, something I know for certain wasn't my imagination. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over the gravel, circling our tent again and again. At first, I assumed it was just an animal investigating the spot we had claimed for the night, but the continued pacing started to put me on edge. The branch outside my small window remained illuminated. I was beginning to drift off slightly when I suddenly noticed the footsteps had stopped, and the branch was no longer in sight. But something much worse took its place. Just a few feet beyond my mesh window, barely visible, was a crouching figure, completely still. Its shape reminded me of the cultists from Outlast 2, a bare-skinned figure with twigs or antlers woven around its head. My poor night vision made it impossible to tell which way it was facing, but I knew it was there. Then, at some point, it vanished. The branch reappeared, and strangely, it started resembling a crucifix to me, though I chalked that up to my nerves playing tricks on me. Exhaustion took over, and I finally fell asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The first thing I did was check around the tent for footprints, but there was nothing but gravel and hardened dirt, leaving no trace behind. During breakfast, we started talking about the night, and that's when I learned that others had seen something too. Apparently, sometime around 2:30 a.m., after I had fallen asleep, a lone person had walked through the campsite carrying a flashlight. It wasn't any of us, and anyone else would have had to travel miles to reach our location. We brushed it off as someone just out for a late-night stroll, but even now, the thought of it makes my skin crawl. I've lived my whole life in North Carolina and love exploring the wilderness, but I have to say, I'll admit, the mountains in Tennessee are some of the best around, and that's why I often drive up there to hike and camp. The trail I took this time was surprisingly tough. Not exactly steep, I've hiked steeper trails out west, but it had endless ups and downs that made it feel like it would never end. As the sun started to set, I realized I needed to stop and set up camp before it got too dark. I stopped about half a mile from the peak, planning to finish the hike in the morning. Nothing unusual happened at first. I found a great spot to camp, ate my food, and got into my tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't seen a single person the entire way up. It didn't feel eerie then, but that would change soon enough. I have a hard time falling asleep and usually lie awake for at least an hour. During that time, I thought I heard faint footsteps nearby. Because the steps had a steady rhythm, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I took my big hunting knife out of my bag and kept it beside me in my sleeping bag. When I woke up, I made some oatmeal for breakfast. As I ate, I glanced at my tent and noticed something odd. A small bundle of dried sticks and berries tied together with a piece of green string, leaning against the side of my tent. Internally, I was freaking out, but I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear in record time and was gone within 5 minutes. No way was I bothering with the summit anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I made my way down, I realized a thick fog had rolled in, making visibility terrible. I must have veered off onto a side trail at some point because soon I was completely lost. Luckily, I had a compass and was able to navigate my way back to the main path. Finally, I made it out without any more issues. Later, I found out that the same morning, a 29-year-old man died on that same section of the trail. If I hadn't gotten lost and taken a different route back, I might have crossed paths with him. His family seems to have removed most of the news reports about him from the internet, but I did manage to find some articles. Supposedly, he fell while trying to climb out of a ravine. He had been separated from his backpack and called 911, but no one ever heard his voice on the call. I have a few more strange stories from camping trips I took as a kid, like one time when I was heading to in the middle of the night. Yeah, I know, totally random, but with everything happening in the world, we just wanted to be out in nature. It was a super spontaneous decision. One moment we were playing PlayStation, and the next we were hit with this huge excitement. Within an hour, we grabbed our stuff, hopped into our cars, and drove out of the city. We ended up in a small town outside the city, parked our cars, and continued on foot since the area we wanted to camp in wasn't suitable for vehicles. It was honestly a blast. Just a bunch of city guys hauling backpacks, tents, knives, and food. It felt like an adventure, and none of us were worried or even slightly cautious, even though we were trekking through the forest at night, far from any civilization, with nothing but our phone flashlights guiding the way. After a few hours, we found what looked like the perfect spot, a peaceful little lake and a big open space. We set up camp and pitched our tents. Something to mention is that all 4 of us had served in the military, so we had survival training and knew how to handle ourselves in the wild. We weren't worried about much. None of us had any weapons with us because in our country, carrying one requires specific permits, and honestly, we didn't feel the need to go through all that trouble. We felt safe as we were. Once we settled in, my friend and I decided to check out the surroundings while the other 2 stayed back, gathering wood for a fire. Later, we all sat around the flames, relaxing, talking, and joking about how unlucky our generation was. The hours passed, and by the time it was around 5 a.m., we figured it was time to get some sleep so we could wake up by noon and still have plenty of daylight to enjoy. Just 5 minutes after getting into our tents, we heard a cat meowing. It sounded distressed. Now, my wife and I have 2 cats at home, and I grew up surrounded by them, so I know when a cat is in trouble or just hungry. We all glanced at each other, a little surprised. How could a cat be out here, deep in the forest? Maybe it was born in the wild, who knows? But we got out of the tent to look for it. That's when we saw it, a black cat. None of us were superstitious or anything, but something about it felt off. I had some sausages in my bag, so I pulled them out and tossed one toward the cat. But just as I did, it vanished. It was dark, and we were in the woods, so I brushed it off. I tried not to overthink it and went back into the tent. About 15 minutes later, one of my friends whispered that something was outside. At first, we figured it was either some stray dogs or maybe the same cat returning. We slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out, and that's when we saw it. A massive, dark shape. For those who don't know, wild boars are no joke. They're tough, aggressive, and have insanely thick skin that's hard to injure. A gun might stop one, but we didn't have that option. We were whispering to each other, trying to figure out what to do if it decided to charge at us with its tusks when we suddenly heard the cat meow again. All of us reacted at the same time. What? The strangest part? The cat and the boar were moving together, right outside our tent, barely a meter away. It was like they were aware of each other, almost familiar. The cat wasn't scared at all. It meowed, walked closer to the boar, and didn't even flinch. It was the weirdest, most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. For an hour, the two creatures just wandered around us, sniffing the air, making us more and more uneasy. But as soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, they disappeared. And so did we. If anyone has an explanation for what we saw, I'd love to hear it. I went down to the creek with my father to brush my teeth, and for some reason, my dog was acting really jittery and uneasy. He kept staring intently at the ground, his body tense. It wasn't until we were heading back that we finally realized what he had been trying to warn us about. A long, bluish-gray water snake suddenly sprang up and slithered right between my legs. My dad reacted instantly, grabbing me and carrying me the rest of the way back to our tents. I was 4 at the time. Another time, when I was around 9, I was on a camping trip with my buddy and both our families. We decided to do some exploring around some massive boulders, wandering further away from our parents, who were chatting and didn't mind us venturing off as long as we stuck together. Before long, we could faintly hear the sound of rushing water. Excited, we hurried down the rocky slope, thinking we might splash around in the stream. That was until we heard a deep, guttural growl, low and angry, coming from the same direction as the water. A wave of unease washed over me, and my friend felt it too. We didn't know what it was, but we weren't about to stick around to find out. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted back toward our campsite. Later on, we discovered that a bear had wandered into the area. Some campers nearby had their tents torn apart and their food supply raided. The tracks led straight back to the very spot by the river where we had heard the noise. If we had ignored our instincts and let curiosity take over, we might have walked right into the path of an angry bear, and we probably wouldn't have made it out to tell the story. Last summer, I camped in a remote, nearly empty campground when we arrived. When we arrived at the campsite, the person in charge warned us that there was a serious bear issue. We were told we could even get fined if we left drinks outside, and that all food had to be locked in a bear-proof container or stored in a vehicle. We were extremely cautious on the first day, but on the second day, someone in our group carelessly dropped a raw piece of meat on my campsite. Instead of cooking it anyway or properly disposing of it in a sealed bag inside the bear box, they decided to toss it into the bushes behind my tent. A few hours later, after having some drinks, I dozed off. In the middle of the night, I was startled awake by the sound of something moving quickly around our tent, where my friend and I were sleeping. At first, I assumed it was the others playing a prank on us and tried to ignore it, but I kept waking up to the sound of something pacing near our tent, sniffing around the area. The most terrifying moment came when it sniffed near our feet. Both of us panicked, crying and screaming while turning on the air mattress pump in an attempt to scare it away. I was absolutely convinced that we were about to be attacked by a bear. Somehow, we were incredibly lucky. Before you ask, I have no idea how we managed to fall back asleep each time. Also, just so you know, the scent of certain substances in a tent can attract bears as well. When I was 10, my parents took my best friend and me on a camping trip in the woods. In Montana, we had one of those trailers with bunk beds, a small kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. One afternoon, my friend and I were wandering around the campsite when a guy walked up and started talking to us. He looked like he was in his late 20s and asked if my friend and I wanted to go for a swim with him. Something about him felt off, so we said no and went back to our parents. We didn't dwell on it too much. Later that night, I woke up. My bed was right next to a window. When I turned over, I saw him standing outside, staring at me through the glass. I screamed, waking everyone up. My dad, irritated about being woken, finally got out of bed, checked outside, and saw nothing. He told us to go back to sleep. In the morning, my dad searched for the guy, but he had already packed up his things and left before sunrise. A few years later, my friends and I planned a camping trip in the